Most people think property disputes begin with shouting. Somebody builds a fence 6 inches too far, a neighbor calls the sheriff, and everyone spends the weekend arguing across a property line. Mine started with silence. One Tuesday morning, while I was drinking coffee on my porch, a pickup truck rolled past my barn without slowing down. I barely looked up. Lost drivers occasionally wandered onto my ranch before realizing they had taken the wrong turn. It wasn't unusual. 10 minutes later, another truck came through. Then an SUV. By lunchtime, I had counted 8 vehicles crossing the same gravel road my father built almost 40 years earlier. I remember setting my coffee cup down and thinking, that's odd. By Friday, odd had become routine. Every weekday morning, headlights appeared just after sunrise like someone had flipped a switch. Contractors towing enclosed trailers. Parents taking children to school. Amazon vans. Landscapers hauling equipment. They all entered from the county highway, crossed my ranch, disappeared through the cottonwood trees, and never once hesitated. They drove with the confidence of people who believe they belong there. My name is Daniel Harper. I'm 61 years old, and except for 4 years in the Army, I've lived on this ranch my entire life. My father blasted that gravel lane through solid rock back in 1984 because the eastern pasture was impossible to reach during spring runoff. Every culvert, every drainage ditch, every load of gravel came out of his own pocket. He used to tell me, land remembers who takes care of it. Back then, I thought he meant fixing fences before they fell over or cleaning irrigation ditches before the snow melted. Years later, I realized he meant something else entirely. Saturday morning, I drove into town to pick up fencing supplies. While the forklift loaded posts into my truck, the cashier nodded toward the highway and grinned. Looks like the neighborhood really appreciates you opening that back entrance. I frowned. Opening what? Your ranch road. He shrugged. Smart move. Everyone says it cuts 10 minutes off the commute. I stared at him long enough that his smile slowly disappeared. Who told you I opened anything? He scratched the back of his neck. I don't know. That's just what people have been saying. People. Not one name. Not one source. Just people. The drive home felt longer than usual. Every mile gave me another question without a single answer. Who started that rumor? Why did everyone believe it? More importantly, why had nobody bothered asking me? The next Monday, I skipped my usual ranch work and parked beside the entrance before daylight. A thin layer of fog still covered the pasture when the first pickup appeared at exactly 6:42. It didn't slow down. The driver didn't look around. He simply turned onto my gravel road as naturally as if he'd been using it for years. A second truck followed less than a minute later. Then 3 commuter cars. Then a plumbing van. It wasn't random traffic. It was a routine. Around 8 o'clock, a white luxury sport utility vehicle slowed beside me. The driver lowered her window and smiled with the kind of confidence that usually belongs to people who never expect to hear the word no. Good morning, she said. Looks like everyone's finally figured out the east entrance. East entrance? I asked. Best thing that's happened to Silver Creek. She laughed lightly. Traffic at the main gate has practically disappeared. Who decided this was an entrance? For the first time, she actually looked at me instead of through me. The board's been encouraging residents to use it. Then she smiled again. Trust me, it's better for everyone. Before I could ask what board she was talking about, she pressed the accelerator and disappeared down the road. I stood there watching the dust settle behind her tires. She had spoken as though the decision had already been made. Not suggested. Not discussed. Made. That afternoon, I drove to the entrance of Silver Creek Estates. Near the community mailbox stood a freshly installed bulletin board covered with neighborhood announcements. Pool hours. A barbecue fundraiser. Landscaping reminders. One laminated notice immediately caught my attention. Help reduce morning congestion. Residents are encouraged to use the east access route during peak traffic hours. There was no map. No mention of my ranch. No statement claiming ownership. Whoever wrote it had been careful. Every sentence was technically true while quietly encouraging hundreds of people to believe something that wasn't. As I stood there reading the notice for a second time, another resident walked past, glanced at the bulletin board, and casually said to his wife, "See? I told you the new entrance was official." They kept walking before I could say a word. That was the moment everything changed. It wasn't just drivers taking a shortcut anymore. An entire neighborhood had accepted a story as fact, and whoever started that story clearly believed I'd never challenge it. I didn't confront a single driver the next morning. That surprised even me. Part of me wanted to stand in the middle of the gravel lane and ask every person where they thought they were going. Instead, I poured another cup of coffee, grabbed a notebook from the kitchen drawer, and sat on the porch where my father used to watch the sunrise. If somebody had turned my family's ranch road into a neighborhood shortcut, I wanted to understand exactly how it had happened before I did anything about it. By the end of the first morning, I already noticed a pattern. Landscaping crews arrived between 6:30 and 7. Parents taking children to school followed right behind them. Delivery vans appeared around 9. Utility trucks preferred the afternoon. None of them hesitated. None of them looked lost. They weren't searching for directions. They were following instructions. Around 10 o'clock, a blue delivery van slowed beside my mailbox. The driver leaned out his window. "Morning," he called. "Is Building 8 straight through?" "Building 8?" I asked. "Silver Creek Estates." He held up his phone. "Customer wrote, use the east entrance. It's faster." I glanced at the screen just long enough to read the delivery note. Sure enough, there it was. Use the east entrance. Nobody had even bothered describing the road anymore. It had become an entrance. "Thanks," he said after I pointed him toward the subdivision. "The app sends everyone this way now." I watched him disappear beneath the cottonwoods, then looked back at my porch. Somewhere, that little gravel lane had found its way into navigation systems, delivery instructions, and everyday conversations. It wasn't just a rumor anymore. It had become habit. Later that afternoon, I drove the length of the road in my old ranch truck. My father had built it for tractors, cattle trailers, and the occasional feed delivery, not hundreds of commuter vehicles every week. Fresh tire tracks covered nearly every inch of the gravel. One shoulder had begun crumbling where larger trucks kept pulling aside to pass each other. Near the eastern pasture, I stopped beside a patch of purple wildflowers. Emily had planted them years ago because she liked seeing color against the gray stone fence. Half of them had been flattened into the dirt by tires cutting the corner. I stood there longer than I expected. Those flowers weren't expensive. They weren't rare. But seeing them crushed by people who probably never even noticed they were there bothered me far more than the extra traffic ever had. "Sorry, Em," I whispered before taking several photographs. The next morning, I returned to the feed store for livestock mineral. An older rancher named Walt was loading hay into his trailer when he spotted me. "Daniel," he called with a grin. "Looks like you've become the unofficial back gate for Silver Creek." "Have I?" "Sure have." He laughed. "Wish somebody would shorten my drive by 10 minutes. Who says it's their back gate?" His smile faded just a little. "Isn't it? Did anyone ever ask me?" Walt stopped tightening the strap on his trailer. After a few seconds, he shook his head. "You know, I honestly never thought about it." That answer stayed with me. Nobody seemed malicious. They simply accepted the story because everyone else had accepted it first. On my way home, I decided to drive past the subdivision again. This time I noticed something I had completely missed before. About 50 yards from the neighborhood entrance stood a professionally made aluminum sign mounted on brand new steel posts. "East Access." A simple arrow pointed directly toward my ranch. No HOA logo. No county seal. No company name. Just 2 words that quietly directed strangers onto private property. I parked across the road and photographed the sign from every angle. As I zoomed in, I noticed fresh concrete around the base of the posts. It hadn't been there very long. While I was putting my camera away, a county maintenance truck drove slowly past. For a second, I wondered if the county workers had installed the sign themselves. Instead, they drove right by without giving it a second glance. Whatever authority that sign carried in people's minds, it hadn't come from the county. Before heading home, I made one final stop along the gravel lane. Something bright caught my eye near the drainage ditch. An orange survey stake stuck out of the ground with pink ribbon fluttering in the breeze. Then I spotted another farther down the road, and another beyond that. Survey crews don't leave markers by accident. Somebody had paid to measure something. I took photographs of every stake without touching a single one. As the evening sun settled behind the hills, I slipped the camera back into my truck and looked down the quiet stretch of gravel. 2 days earlier, I thought I was dealing with careless drivers following a bad shortcut. Standing there beside those survey stakes, I realized I had been looking at the wrong problem. The traffic wasn't the plan. It was only the beginning of one. The orange survey stakes stayed exactly where they were for the next several days. Every morning, another wave of commuter traffic rolled past them without anyone seeming to notice. I noticed. Every time I drove by, I counted them again. One beside the drainage ditch, another near the old cattle guard, three more spaced evenly along the eastern curve. Survey markers don't appear because someone is curious. They appear because somebody intends to do something. The question was what? I called the county survey office that Thursday morning. After giving the clerk my parcel number, I asked if there had been any recent county survey work on my property. She placed me on hold for nearly 5 minutes before returning. No county projects, she said. Nothing scheduled, either. What about private survey requests? Those aren't always filed with us unless they're recorded later. It wasn't the answer I wanted, but it eliminated one possibility. Whatever those stakes represented, the county hadn't ordered them. That afternoon, I decided to follow the road instead of the traffic. Rather than stopping near the entrance, I slowly drove the entire length of the gravel lane, pulling over every few hundred yards to photograph the shoulders, culverts, fence lines, and survey markers. Years of ranch work had taught me that small details mattered. Fresh tire ruts showed where larger trucks had started cutting across the grass to pass one another. Drainage channels my father had dug decades earlier were beginning to collapse under the extra weight. One cattle guard had shifted nearly half an inch because vehicles crossed it hundreds of times each week instead of a few times each month. None of the damage looked dramatic by itself. Together, it told a different story. This road wasn't being visited. It was being used. Near the eastern pasture, I spotted an older man wearing a reflective vest setting up a tripod beside one of the orange stakes. I parked a respectful distance away and walked over. "Morning," I said. He nodded politely. "Morning. Working this property?" "Just confirming some measurements." He spoke carefully, the way professionals do when they know they shouldn't discuss a client's business. "County project?" I asked. "Private contract." He looked toward the subdivision for only a fraction of a second before returning to his instrument. It was enough. I thanked him for his time and walked back to my truck. He had never mentioned Silver Creek, but he didn't have to. The direction of his glance answered more than his words ever could. Friday morning, I drove straight to the county recorder's office instead of checking fences. The recorder behind the counter listened patiently while I explained why I wanted every document connected to my eastern boundary. 20 minutes later, she returned carrying a stack of recorded plats, deeds, and easement maps. We spread them across a large wooden table in the public records room. I traced my property line with one finger while comparing every recorded document. My deed matched my father's. My father's matched my grandfather's. The gravel road remained entirely inside our parcel from beginning to end. I searched every recorded easement affecting neighboring land. Utility easements, drainage easements, telephone lines, water access. Nothing granted public travel across my ranch. "Am I missing something?" I asked the recorder. She adjusted her glasses and reviewed the maps again. "No." She tapped the original subdivision plat for Silver Creek Estates. Their approved entrance has always been County Road 12. So there was never a second entrance? She shook her head. "Not according to anything recorded here." I thanked her, paid for certified copies, and carried the documents back to my truck. The binder on my passenger seat was beginning to grow thicker every day, but one thing still bothered me. If the records were this clear, why did so many people believe otherwise? The answer came sooner than I expected. That evening, Silver Creek held its monthly HOA meeting at the neighborhood clubhouse. I parked across the street where nobody would recognize my truck and walked in after introducing myself as a nearby property owner interested in traffic issues. Nobody questioned it. Nearly 60 residents filled the folding chairs. About halfway through the meeting, the HOA president stepped to the podium. The moment I saw her, I recognized the white luxury SUV and the confident smile from my ranch entrance. "I'm Vanessa Holloway," she began. "First, I'd like to thank everyone for helping reduce congestion by using our east access route." Several homeowners nodded approvingly. One even clapped. Vanessa smiled and continued. "Travel times have improved dramatically, and we've received wonderful feedback from residents." She never said the HOA owned the road. She never claimed there was a legal easement. She simply spoke as though the route naturally belonged to the community. It was subtle, carefully worded, and incredibly effective. During the question period, a homeowner stood up. "Will the east entrance stay open permanently?" Vanessa answered without the slightest hesitation. We don't anticipate any changes. The room relaxed immediately. People smiled, took notes, and moved on to the next agenda item. Sitting quietly in the back row, I realized something important. The residents weren't trying to steal my road. Most of them genuinely believed the HOA had already handled everything. They trusted the board. They trusted the signs. They trusted the newsletters. And because nobody questioned the story had become their reality. On the drive home, I kept thinking about one place I hadn't searched yet. My father's old workshop still stood behind the equipment barn, exactly as he had left it. He kept every survey, every receipt, every handwritten sketch connected to this ranch. If there was anything that proved why he built that road in 1984, it would be in that workshop. And if my father had taught me anything, it was never to underestimate a man who saved paperwork. My father's workshop sat behind the equipment barn exactly the way he had left it 6 years earlier. Most people would have called it cluttered. I called it organized patience. Every shelf held neatly labeled boxes. Coffee cans were filled with bolts, sorted by size. Old survey flags hung beside worn leather tool belts. Even after all those years, the place still smelled faintly of cedar, machine oil, and fresh-cut lumber. Dad had always believed throwing away paperwork was the quickest way to lose an argument. At the time, I thought he was talking about tax records. Standing there surrounded by decades of carefully labeled folders, I began to wonder if he'd been preparing me for something far bigger. I started with the metal filing cabinets against the back wall. One drawer held livestock records. Another contained equipment warranties. The third was labeled simply, roads. Inside were dozens of folders dating back nearly 40 years. Every gravel delivery receipt, every culvert invoice, every fuel purchase for the bulldozer. My father had documented almost everything. Near the bottom sat a thick brown envelope with faded handwriting across the front. East Ranch Access Road. Spring 1984. I carried it to the workbench and carefully emptied the contents. Construction sketches. Handwritten. Measurements. Fuel receipts. Photographs of the bulldozer cutting through solid limestone. Then I unfolded a large survey map that had yellowed with age. Across the center, stamped by a licensed surveyor, were the words, East Ranch Access Road. Private ranch maintenance only. Completion date, May 1984. I stared at those 6 words for a long moment. Private ranch maintenance only. They had been written years before Silver Creek Estates even existed. Before anyone dreamed of a subdivision. Before anyone imagined hundreds of commuters would someday treat the road as public. Dad hadn't just built a road. He had documented exactly why he built it. Tucked inside the envelope was one more surprise. A small spiral notebook filled with my father's handwriting. Most of the entries were ordinary construction notes. Ordered more gravel. Installed second culvert. Finished drainage ditch before rain. Then one sentence caught my attention. County asked whether road would ever become public. Declined. Keeping ranch access private. I read it twice just to make sure I hadn't misunderstood. My father had already answered the very question everyone seemed to be arguing about now. And he had answered it more than 40 years ago. The following morning, I drove to the County Public Works office, carrying copies of everything I had found. After a short wait, I was introduced to Carl Benson, an engineer who had worked for the county longer than almost anyone else. His gray hair and weathered face suggested he had spent decades solving problems most people never noticed. Carl adjusted his glasses while studying the old survey. I remember this road, he said quietly. You do? Barely. Your father came in during construction asking about drainage permits. He smiled faintly. He wanted to make sure every culvert met county standards, even though it was private. Carl opened several archived maps on his computer and compared them with the survey I had brought. After nearly 20 minutes, he leaned back in his chair. Everything matches. There was never a public dedication? No. Never an easement? No. He pointed toward the subdivision map displayed on his monitor. Silver Creek's approved entrance has always been on County Road 12. That's the only legal access shown on every recorded plan. Then why is everyone using my road? Carl gave a tired smile that suggested he had seen similar situations before. Because once enough people repeat something, it starts sounding official. Before I left, he printed certified copies of several archived roadway maps for me. As he handed them across the desk, he added, Paperwork has a longer memory than people. I liked that sentence enough to write it in my notebook. That afternoon, I called Richard Coleman, the property attorney whose name several ranchers in town had recommended over the years. His office occupied the second floor of an old brick building overlooking the courthouse square. Richard greeted me with a firm handshake, then spent nearly an hour reading every survey, deed, receipt, notebook entry, and certified map without interrupting once. When he finally looked up, his expression hadn't changed. "Daniel," he said calmly, "how many times has the HOA asked your permission to use this road?" "Never." "How many times has anyone offered compensation or requested an easement?" "Never." He slowly closed the binder. "Good. I wasn't expecting that answer." "Good. Because permission matters." He tapped the stack of documents between us. "Everything you've shown me says the same thing. The road is private. It has always been private. More importantly, every government record agrees. Then why hasn't any of this stopped them?" Richard smiled slightly. "Because facts and beliefs usually travel at different speeds." He reached for a legal pad and drew a simple timeline across the page. On one end, he wrote 1984. On the other, he wrote today. Between them, he listed my father's survey, the recorded deed, county maps, the HOA newsletter, the East Access sign, and the photographs I had taken over the past several weeks. Then he slid the paper across the desk. "This isn't just a property dispute anymore." "What is it?" "A story." I frowned. Richard pointed at the timeline again. "The HOA has been telling one story. Your documents tell another. The question isn't which story sounds better. It's which one a judge, a county official, or a sheriff can verify." For the first time since strange traffic started crossing my ranch, I felt the weight on my shoulders begin to lighten. I wasn't relying on opinions anymore. I was relying on records that had existed decades before Silver Creek Estates was ever built. As I gathered the papers to leave, Richard stopped me with one final instruction. "From this point forward," he said, "don't argue with anyone. Don't remove the sign. Don't confront drivers. Let them keep believing exactly what they're believing." "Why?" He smiled in a way that reminded me of a chess player seeing several moves ahead. "Because sometimes the strongest case is the one your opponent keeps building for you without realizing it." Richard asked me to come back the following Monday with every document I could find, no matter how unimportant it seemed. "People usually think lawsuits are won by one dramatic piece of evidence," he told me over the phone. "Most of the time, they're won by 50 ordinary pieces that all point in the same direction." By the time I arrived at his office, the binder barely closed. My father's construction notes, certified deeds, survey maps, county plats, photographs of damaged shoulders, pictures of flattened wildflowers, the HOA bulletin, the East Access sign, even the notebook where I had written the times traffic entered my ranch each day. Richard spread everything across the conference table without saying a word. He moved slowly from one document to another until the entire table became a timeline stretching more than 40 years. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. "Notice something?" I looked over the papers again. "They're all saying the same thing." "Exactly." He picked up my father's 1984 survey. "Private road." Next came the county maps. "Private road." Then the recorded deed. "Private road." Finally, he held up the HOA newsletter encouraging residents to use the East Access route. "And here's the only document telling a different story." He placed it beside the others. "Not because it says the road belongs to the HOA. It never actually says that. It simply encourages people to act as though it does." I had never looked at it that way before. Vanessa had been careful. Every sentence avoided making a direct legal claim. Yet together, the signs, conversations, and newsletters had convinced an entire neighborhood that permission already existed. "She isn't lying outright," I said. Richard nodded. "No, she's letting everyone reach the conclusion she wants." He smiled faintly. "Courts pay attention to that." Before leaving, Richard handed me a yellow legal pad. "From today forward, document everything. Every conversation, every photograph, every letter, especially anything the HOA creates." "Why their documents?" I asked. "Because people trust statements made against their own interest far more than statements made by the person filing the complaint." I understood exactly what he meant 2 days later. Early Wednesday morning, I noticed two men installing a larger version of the East Access sign near the subdivision entrance. I parked across the road and watched from inside my truck. The new aluminum sign looked professionally manufactured, complete with reflective lettering visible from several hundred feet away. East access. Large arrow. Nothing else. No county logo. No state highway marker. Just enough information to direct every driver straight onto my ranch. I photographed every stage of the installation, including the fresh bags of concrete sitting beside the steel posts before they buried them. One of the workers noticed me taking pictures and walked over. "Everything okay?" he asked politely. "Just curious who ordered the sign." He shrugged. "We're subcontractors." "Who hired you?" "Don't know." He pointed toward his paperwork. "We just install what's on the work order." As he climbed back into his truck, he added one sentence almost as an afterthought. "The neighborhood manager said they wanted it to look permanent." Permanent. I wrote that word in my notebook before driving away. That afternoon, another unexpected piece of evidence arrived without me asking for it. A landscaping company stopped along my fence line to unload equipment for one of the subdivision homes. While chatting with the foreman, I casually mentioned the traffic crossing. My ranch. He looked genuinely surprised. "I figured the HOA owned this entrance." "Why?" "Because that's what they told us when we bid the maintenance contract." "Who told you?" "One of the board members during the walkthrough." He paused for a moment before adding, "They said to use the east entrance because that's the community access road now." Community access road. I thanked him for the conversation and wrote everything down the moment he drove away. By the end of the week, my notebook contained half a dozen similar conversations. Nobody claimed to have researched ownership. Nobody said they had seen a recorded easement. They all believed the same thing because someone they trusted had repeated it with enough confidence. Friday afternoon, Richard called again. "Anything new?" I described the larger sign, the landscaping crew, and the repeated references to the road as the community entrance. He didn't sound surprised. "Excellent." I laughed. "Excellent. Daniel, every time they describe your private road as their entrance, they're strengthening your position. Even if they're wrong. Especially if they're wrong." He paused before continuing. "Think about it. If they truly believed they owned legal access, they would have recorded an easement years ago. Instead, they're relying on signs, newsletters, and assumptions. That's not ownership. That's wishful thinking." Before hanging up, he gave me one instruction that sounded almost backwards. "Whatever you do," he said, "don't remove that sign. It's pointing strangers onto my property." "I know. Then why leave it?" Richard chuckled quietly. "Because sometimes the most convincing evidence is the evidence your opponent insists on displaying in public." As I stood on my porch that evening watching another line of commuter traffic disappear beneath the cottonwoods, I finally understood what he meant. The sign wasn't my problem anymore. It was theirs. Every car that followed it wasn't weakening my case. It was proving exactly how far the HOA's story had spread, and how much harder the truth would hit when the paperwork finally caught up with it. By the beginning of the following week, the traffic no longer surprised me. At exactly 6:45 every morning, the first wave of commuter vehicles crossed my ranch. By 7:30, another steady stream followed. The gravel had become so compacted that fresh tire marks barely lasted until noon before another 100 vehicles erased them. I stopped counting cars altogether. Instead, I focused on documenting everything they left behind. New ruts, widening shoulders, fresh photographs, more pages in the binder. Every evening, I added another date, another picture, another note. The facts were becoming impossible to ignore, even if nobody else had noticed them yet. Tuesday afternoon, I was repairing a fence near the eastern pasture when the familiar white luxury SUV rolled slowly toward me. Vanessa stepped out carrying a leather portfolio tucked beneath one arm. She smiled as though we were neighbors discussing garden plans instead of standing in the middle of a dispute she had helped create. "Daniel," she said pleasantly, "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Depends what you came for." She laughed softly, pretending not to hear the edge in my voice. "The board has been reviewing traffic patterns, and we have a few recommendations that could improve safety." She opened the portfolio and handed me several neatly printed pages. At first glance, they looked almost official. There were diagrams, photographs, and bullet points describing proposed improvements. Widen the eastern curve. Install reflective markers. Replace the cattle guard with a heavier commercial model. Trim the oak branches over the roadway. Improve drainage along both shoulders. I looked up from the papers. "These are recommendations?" "Yes." She smiled confidently. "This road serves hundreds of homeowners now. We think these upgrades would benefit everyone." Benefit everyone? Absolutely. She pointed toward the diagrams. Traffic keeps increasing, so we'd love to see construction begin before winter. I folded the pages carefully and handed them back. Reasonable improvements usually begin with asking the owner's permission. Her smile tightened just enough for me to notice. Daniel, I don't think this needs to become personal. I couldn't help smiling. It's difficult to imagine something more personal than someone telling me how to improve my own property. For a brief moment, neither of us spoke. She looked past me toward the gravel road where another delivery van rolled through without slowing down. People depend on this entrance now, she finally said. No, I answered calmly. People depend on believing they have permission. The confidence disappeared from her face for only a second before she recovered. I'm sure we'll work something out. She climbed back into her SUV and drove away, leaving a thin cloud of dust hanging over the pasture. I watched until the vehicle disappeared through the cottonwoods, then pulled my phone from my pocket and took one photograph of the tire tracks she had left behind. Not because I needed evidence of where she had driven, because I wanted to remember exactly how confident she still looked. That evening, I scanned the maintenance recommendations and emailed copies to Richard. Less than an hour later, my phone rang. I answered before the second ring. You've got to be kidding, Richard said, almost laughing. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. I could hear papers moving across his desk. Daniel, this is one of the strongest documents we've received yet. A list of suggestions? Not suggestions. He paused. Read the first sentence out loud. I found the document on my desk. In order to accommodate the growing traffic using the east entrance. Exactly. So, they're acknowledging regular neighborhood traffic across your private road in writing. He let that sink in before continuing. And then they tell the property owner how he should upgrade it to serve their residents better. I leaned back in my chair. I hadn't thought about it that way. That's why you hired me. He laughed quietly. Remember what I told you? Sometimes your opponent builds your case for you. 2 days later, another certified envelope arrived in my mailbox. Inside was a polite follow-up letter from the HOA thanking me for meeting with Vanessa and expressing hope that I would complete the recommended improvements soon for the benefit of the Silver Creek community. They even attached another copy of the maintenance list. I read the letter twice before placing it into the binder. They still hadn't asked for permission. They still hadn't mentioned an easement. They simply wrote as though the decision had already belonged to them. Friday afternoon, I made one more visit to the county recorder's office. Not because I expected anything different, but because I wanted absolute certainty before taking another step. The clerk searched every updated filing connected to my parcel while I waited. After several minutes, she looked up and smiled politely. Nothing new. No easements. None. No recorded access agreements. She turned her monitor slightly, so I could see the screen. Your property records haven't changed. I thanked her, walked back to my truck, and sat there for several quiet minutes. Around me, ordinary life continued without interruption. People hurried across parking lots carrying groceries. Parents loaded children into family cars. Nobody knew that a single sentence buried inside county records was about to determine the future of an entire neighborhood's daily routine. When I reached Richard's office later that afternoon, I handed him the recorder's confirmation. He added it to the growing stack of documents, closed the binder with both hands, and looked at me with a calm smile. That's it, he said. We've waited long enough. I looked down at the thick binder that now held more than 40 years of paperwork, photographs, letters, surveys, and official records. The evidence was complete. The only thing left was deciding exactly how and when to remind an entire neighborhood that convenience had never been the same thing as permission. Richard called early Monday morning and asked me to bring the binder back to his office. By then it had grown so thick that the rings barely closed. Every photograph was labeled by date. Every conversation was written down while it was still fresh. Every letter sat inside a plastic sleeve beside the document that explained why it mattered. Looking at it all together, I realized something had changed. Weeks earlier, I had been trying to prove I owned my own road. Now I was simply documenting how many different ways other people had treated it as theirs. Richard cleared his conference table before opening the binder. One by one, he arranged everything in chronological order. My father's 1984 survey, the original deed, county plats, certified recorder's maps, photographs of damaged shoulders, the HOA newsletter, the east access sign, Vanessa's maintenance recommendations. The follow-up letter thanking me for discussing improvements. He stepped back and folded his arms. Tell me what you see. I looked across the table. 40 years of paperwork. Look again. It took me another minute before I understood. Every government document told one story. Every HOA document told another. They never overlapped. Richard smiled. Exactly. He picked up my father's survey. Private road. Then the county maps. Private road. He tapped the deed. Private road. Finally, he lifted Vanessa's letter. This road serves hundreds of homeowners. He placed it back on the table. Notice what's missing? Permission. Better than that. He looked directly at me. Any legal authority to say it at all. He slid the letter back into its sleeve. Daniel, this isn't just evidence anymore. It's a complete timeline showing when reality ended and assumptions took over. That afternoon, we met a licensed county surveyor at the ranch. His crew unloaded GPS equipment, total stations, measuring rods, and bright orange flags before carefully locating every recorded property monument. They checked bearings against the original subdivision plat, verified corner pins that had been in the ground for decades, and measured the entire eastern boundary twice. I stayed well away from their work. Professionals are at their best when nobody tells them what answer they're supposed to find. Nearly 4 hours later, the crew chief walked toward me carrying a clipboard. Everything matches county records, he said. Any discrepancies? None. He pointed toward the gravel lane. The entire roadway stays inside your parcel from beginning to end. No overlap. Not even close. He handed me a signed, sealed survey drawing showing every measurement. Looking at those crisp black lines, I couldn't help thinking about my father. 40 years earlier, he had paid another surveyor to draw almost the same map. The land hadn't changed. Only people's assumptions had. Richard reviewed the new survey the moment I arrived back at his office. He nodded once before opening another folder I hadn't seen before. I think we're ready. Inside were architectural drawings printed on oversized paper. At first I assumed they showed a new equipment shed. Then I read the title block. Decorative limestone entry wall. The plan showed a professionally designed stone wall beginning several feet inside my property line. Native limestone. Reinforced concrete footing. Matching stone columns that mirrored the entrance near my ranch house. No gate. No chain. No steel barrier. Just a permanent landscape feature that naturally completed the front edge of my property. I looked at Richard. This closes the road. No, he corrected gently. This finishes your entrance. He tapped the survey. Legally, that's a very important distinction. People aren't going to see it that way. People don't decide property rights. He smiled. County records do. We submitted the construction permit before the office closed that afternoon. The application included the certified survey, engineering drawings, drainage details, and every required setback measurement. 2 days later, the permit was approved without a single correction request. The county building department treated it exactly like any other landscaping improvement on private property, because that's exactly what it was. On Thursday, I stopped by the Public Works office to thank Carl Benson for all the time he had spent answering my questions. When I mentioned the approved permit, he leaned back in his chair and smiled knowingly. Guess everything checked out. It did. Funny thing about property lines. He picked up one of the archived maps still sitting on his desk. They don't move just because traffic gets heavier. I laughed. Seems a lot of people forgot that. Carl folded the map carefully before putting it back into the file cabinet. People confuse convenience with entitlement all the time. He paused before adding one sentence that stayed with me long after I left. Ownership isn't determined by how many people use something. It's determined by who has the paperwork. That evening, I slipped the approved permit into the binder and closed it one final time. Outside, another steady stream of commuter traffic crossed my ranch exactly as it had every weekday for weeks. Drivers waved politely as they passed, completely unaware that every signature, every permit, every survey, and every legal document was now in place. They believed tomorrow morning would look exactly like today. I watched the last SUV disappear beneath the cottonwoods and couldn't help wondering how many of those same drivers would still believe the road belonged to them once they discovered that the only thing keeping it open had never been traffic, habit, or HOA newsletters. It had always been the permission of the one person nobody had ever bothered to ask. Construction started the following Monday just after sunrise. The first truck through my gate carried pallets of native limestone wrapped in heavy plastic. Behind it came a skid steer, a concrete mixer, and 3 experienced masons who looked more interested in finishing the project before the afternoon heat than in whatever neighborhood controversy surrounded the ranch. Before unloading a single tool, the foreman walked the property line with me, comparing every survey stake to the approved construction drawings. He checked measurements twice, nodded once, and folded the plans. "Everything's inside your property," he said. "Exactly where it's supposed to be." "That's all I wanted to hear," I replied. By 7 o'clock, the excavation had begun. A narrow trench followed the surveyed boundary, while commuters continued driving through the temporary opening exactly as they had every weekday for weeks. Some slowed down to look at the equipment. Others smiled and waved, assuming I had finally decided to improve what they believed was the neighborhood entrance. One man in a pickup leaned out his window and shouted, "Looks great. About time somebody fixed this place up." I smiled politely and waved back. There was no point correcting him yet. The truth would introduce itself soon. Enough. Around 9:30, the familiar white luxury SUV pulled onto the shoulder. Vanessa stepped out wearing sunglasses and carrying a travel mug. She looked genuinely pleased. "Daniel," she called cheerfully. "This is wonderful." "Morning." She looked over the stacks of limestone with obvious approval. "The board has been hoping you'd upgrade the entrance." "Have you?" "Absolutely." She pointed toward the construction crew. "First impressions matter. This road serves the whole community now." I simply looked at her. She walked closer, studying the rolled construction plans resting on the tailgate of the foreman's truck. "Are you widening the road?" she asked. "No." "Adding another lane?" "No." She laughed lightly. "Well, whatever you're building, it'll definitely make the neighborhood look nicer." The foreman glanced at me, clearly sensing there was more to the conversation than he understood. I simply wished Vanessa a pleasant day. She climbed back into her SUV completely satisfied, apparently convinced I had accepted the HOA's vision without saying so directly. As she drove away, the foreman shook his head. "She seems awfully excited about a project on your property." "She thinks it's her entrance," I answered. He looked toward the departing SUV, then back at the survey stakes marking the property line. "She's going to have an interesting week." By late afternoon, the reinforced concrete footing had been poured. Before the crew packed up, a county building inspector arrived for the scheduled inspection. He measured setbacks, compared them with the approved survey, checked reinforcement placement, and signed the inspection report without hesitation. "Everything matches the permit," he said. "Looks good." He handed the signed paperwork to the foreman and drove away. One more official document. One more confirmation that every step had followed the law. Tuesday morning, the first limestone blocks began rising from the cured footing. Each stone had been cut before arriving on site, allowing the masons to fit them together with almost invisible joints. By lunchtime, the structure already resembled the entrance walls surrounding my ranch house farther up the property. It looked elegant, permanent, intentional. Most importantly, it looked exactly as though it had always belonged there. Drivers still squeezed through the temporary construction gap without questioning what the finished design would become. Shortly after noon, Vanessa returned, this time accompanied by 2 HOA board members. All 3 stood quietly for several moments watching the masons position another massive limestone block. Finally, one board member approached the foreman. "Where's the vehicle opening going?" he asked. The foreman unfolded the construction drawings and pointed calmly at the finished elevation. "There isn't one." The man blinked. "No, I mean where residents drive through." "They don't." Vanessa stepped closer, frowning for the first time since I'd met her. "Daniel," she said slowly, "what exactly are you building?" "My front entrance." "No." She shook her head. "The neighborhood entrance." "No," I answered calmly. "Those are 2 very different things." She looked at the nearly completed wall, then back toward the survey stakes, then at the permit clipped to the foreman's board. Her confident smile disappeared. "You can't block access for hundreds of homeowners." Before I answered, the foreman spoke first. "Ma'am, we're constructing a permitted landscape wall entirely on private property. Everything has been inspected and approved by the county." Vanessa ignored him. "Daniel, people depend on this road." People depended on believing they had permission. Traffic will back up for miles. Then they'll have to use the entrance the subdivision was built with. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Behind Vanessa, Commuter vehicles began slowing one after another as drivers realized the opening they expected was steadily disappearing behind solid limestone. Some rolled down their windows. Others simply stared in confusion. Nobody seemed angry yet. They were trying to understand what they were seeing. Because for the first time, the physical reality in front of them no longer matched the story they had been told. The survey hadn't changed. The deeds hadn't changed. The county records hadn't changed. Only one thing was disappearing. Stone by stone. The assumption that private property eventually becomes public if enough people act like it already is. The last limestone block was set into place just before sunset on Wednesday. The masons cleaned their tools, swept the remaining gravel from the driveway, and stepped back to admire the finished entrance. It wasn't tall enough to look defensive. It wasn't flashy enough to attract attention. It simply looked like it belonged there, matching the stone columns surrounding my ranch house as though both had been built at the same time. If someone had driven past without knowing the history, they would have assumed the entrance had always looked exactly that way. The foreman handed me the signed completion paperwork. "Beautiful project," he said. "Hard to believe anyone ever thought there should have been a road through here." I smiled but didn't answer. Some lessons were better learned firsthand. Thursday morning began exactly as every other weekday had for the past several months. At 6:42, the first pickup appeared over the hill. It slowed as it approached the limestone wall. The driver frowned, pulled closer, and stopped completely. 10 seconds later, another truck arrived behind him. Then an SUV. Then a plumbing van. Within 5 minutes, a line of vehicles stretched almost to the county highway. Drivers climbed out one by one, staring silently at the stone wall as though it had appeared overnight. One man walked toward the property line with his phone still in his hand. "Where's the entrance?" he asked. "You're looking at it," I replied from the porch. He shook his head. "No, the road into Silver Creek. Silver Creek's entrance is on County Road 12. He looked genuinely confused. "We've been driving through here every day." "I know. You can't just close it." Before I answered, another voice spoke from behind the growing crowd. "Actually, he can." Richard Coleman walked through the ranch gate carrying nothing more than the familiar leather binder. He stopped beside me just as another white SUV turned sharply off the highway. Vanessa climbed out before the engine had even stopped running. "Daniel," she shouted, "what have you done?" "Finished my entrance." She pointed toward the limestone wall. "You've blocked the neighborhood access road." "No," Richard answered calmly before I could speak. "He's improved his client's private property." Vanessa turned toward him. "Who are you?" "Richard Coleman, Mr. Harper's attorney." She folded her arms. "Hundreds of homeowners depend on this road." Richard opened the binder without the slightest hint of emotion. "Can you show us the recorded easement giving them that right?" Vanessa hesitated. "Everyone knows we've been using it." "That's not what I asked." She looked around at the waiting homeowners, hoping someone else would answer for her. Nobody did. Just then a county building inspector arrived, followed moments later by a sheriff's deputy responding to several calls from confused residents. The deputy greeted everyone politely before asking a single question. "Who's the property owner?" Richard handed him the binder. The deputy reviewed the recorded deed, the certified survey, the building permit, the completed inspection reports, and the county plats without interruption. When he finished, he handed everything back to Richard and turned toward the crowd. "County records show this roadway has always been entirely within Mr. Harper's private property." The building inspector nodded in agreement. The stone wall was constructed under a valid permit and passed every required inspection. Vanessa stepped forward again. "But we've been using this entrance for months." The deputy looked at her respectfully. "Using private property doesn't create a legal right to continue using it. The HOA approved it. The HOA doesn't have authority over land it doesn't own." Those 11 words changed the atmosphere immediately. One homeowner looked directly at Vanessa. "You told us this entrance was permanent." Another spoke before she could answer. "You said everything had already been worked out." A landscaper who had been waiting in traffic shook his head. "That's why our company started using this route." Then came the question Vanessa couldn't answer. An older resident stepped forward holding one of the HOA newsletters I recognized immediately. "Did you ever have his permission?" Silence. Not hesitation. Not uncertainty. Silence. Vanessa looked down at the newsletter in his hand, then toward the limestone wall, then at the dozens of homeowners now waiting for an explanation instead of offering support. For the first time since I had met her beside my ranch entrance weeks earlier, confidence disappeared from her face completely. One family quietly turned their SUV around and headed toward County Road 12. Another followed. Within minutes, the entire line dissolved without a single argument. The shortcut was gone. More importantly, so was the illusion that had kept it alive. News traveled through Silver Creek Estates faster than traffic ever had. At the next HOA meeting, the clubhouse was packed. Homeowners demanded to know who ordered the east access signs, who approved the newsletters, who decided to direct hundreds of families across private property without confirming ownership, why no attorney had been consulted, why county records had never been checked. According to several neighbors who attended, the meeting lasted nearly 4 hours. Nobody left satisfied. 2 weeks later, Vanessa resigned as HOA president. There was no speech, no public defense, and no attempt to explain what had happened. Her name simply disappeared from the next community newsletter beneath a short announcement scheduling a special election. By spring, my ranch had become quiet again. Emily's wildflowers bloomed beside the road without fresh tire tracks cutting through them. The drainage ditches held after heavy rain. Meadowlarks replaced commuter engines as the loudest sound outside my porch. Sometimes people driving along the county highway slowed to admire the limestone entrance before continuing toward the subdivision's actual gate. Most assumed it had always looked that way. I never corrected them. Every now and then someone asks whether I regret ending the shortcut. I always give the same answer. I never closed anyone's road. They usually look puzzled, so I add one more sentence. I simply reminded everyone whose road it had always been. My father once told me that land remembers who takes care of it. It took me years to understand what he meant. Property lines aren't protected by fences, signs, or even stone walls. They're protected by people willing to respect them. And when respect disappears, the paperwork quietly waits its turn. In the end, it wasn't the limestone wall that defeated the HOA. It was 40 years of truth, patiently preserved in deeds, surveys, and county records, finally speaking louder than assumptions ever could.